In this video, I wanted to address an issue with the Legacy Standard Bible that I've seen some people bring up online, particularly those who are continuationists. In their theology, they believe, for example, that the gift of speaking in tongues in the Spirit is for today. And so they look at this rendering that we're going to look at here in 1 Corinthians 12:10 as not being a good translation. So let's read it and we'll talk about it here and see if they're right. It says, "To another workings of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the distinguishing of spirits, to someone else various kinds of tongues, and to another the translation of tongues." And what the continuationists that I have seen are arguing is that instead of translation, this should be rendered interpretation, which you do see here in the footnote. It says, or interpretation. So this is talking in this passage about God giving people certain abilities, and the Spirit gives some people the ability to interpret tongues, or as it says here, translate tongues. And so I do think that on a theological level, I understand why people are giving pushback to this rendering. However, from a translation standpoint, I think you can make the case that this is actually a perfectly valid way to render this word. If you look at blueletterbible.com, it talks about in this verse the interpretation here from the NASB, but the word is hermeneia. It is a noun, and if you look up that word, interpretation is the first entry here in the outline of biblical use. But as you go down here and you look at the Strong's entry, it does say here translation or interpretation. So it can be translation, and it's saying it's from the same as G2059, which is the verb form of this word, which is hermeneuo. It's the verb. And if you look at the outline of biblical usage for this word, it's to explain in words, to expound, to interpret. But then here's the definition under that: to translate what has been spoken or written in a foreign language into the vernacular. We can actually see an example of this verb form, hermeneuo, in John 1:42. And what you'll see is that sometimes a translation like the King James will put interpretation. Thou shalt be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. In the American Standard Version, interpretation. But if you keep going here, the Christian Standard Bible says, which is translated Peter, Cephas, which is translated Peter. And nobody has a problem with that because we're clearly going from the Aramaic to the Greek, from one language to another. And so, of course, that word means translated. That's really what the word is indicating there. And in the ESV, it just says, which means Peter. If you go down here, though, the Legacy Standard Bible, it says Cephas, which is translated Peter. So the Legacy Standard Bible, I would argue, is actually being consistent. This is the verb form of the word, hermeneuo, and it's saying that this word here, Cephas, is translated in another language as Peter. You see it here in the New American Standard Bible. Also in the NET, the New English Translation, translated. The NIV also has translated, and even the New King James Version has translated for this word. So over and over we see different translations taking that word, hermeneuo, and rendering it in this instance as translated. So getting back to the verse in question, to another the translation of tongues, the reason that they would prefer the word interpretation, I think, is because of how they understand the word tongues. And if you look at tongues as some sort of maybe a heavenly ecstatic speech, then maybe interpretation makes more sense to you. However, if tongues is just talking about other languages, then translation fits the context, fits the phrase here. And if you look up that word tongues, and again, we're going back to this. This is the word glossa in Greek. And you look that up. And the outline of biblical usage here is the tongue, a member of the body, an organ of speech. And then here, the second definition, a tongue is the language or dialect used by a particular people distinct from that of other nations. So clearly the word tongue can mean languages. That's really, we can see instances in the Bible where tongues is talking about languages. That's the word for language, which makes sense because the way we speak, the manner in which we speak, the way we convey words is with our tongue. So different people have different ways of speaking, different tongues. So getting back to the verse here, when it uses the word tongue, you could think of that as language. And what do you do with language? You translate it. And we've seen how in the verb form you can render that word as translate. We actually see that in the scripture itself. The Legacy Standard Bible is not being inconsistent, I don't think, in its rendering of this word as translation. Though I understand the theological argument that people might have with this and why they may look at it differently, I think from a translation perspective, the way they've rendered this is perfectly valid. And I did see one video where someone was saying that this is a wrong translation, you can't render the word this way. And I think, hopefully I've shown you here that it's absolutely valid to render the word in this way. And I just wanted to give a little defense of the Legacy Standard Bible. And I'm not an expert in the languages, but I think I have enough insight, knowledge here based on what I'm reading in these different resources to be able to say this. And certainly one of the points I want to make is that people who do these translations a lot of times are experts. And so I'm very reluctant to criticize something unless I've really looked into it. And sure enough, when I look into this, I can see the reasoning behind why they rendered the word in this way. Is there a theological slant to this? Perhaps there is. But is it a valid rendering? Can you translate the word this way? And I would say absolutely it is one way to translate this word. And it really just comes down to different people having different theological understandings and leanings in how they look at Scripture. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think in the comment section below. But I hope this was helpful in an interesting tidbit of information for you. Thank you so much, though, for taking some time to look at this subject with me from a first perspective.